Wander Wealthy Podcast, episode 156 with Justine Chan. Hello, my babes. Welcome back to another episode of the Wander Wealthy Podcast. My name is Tess. I'm the host, and today we have an amazing episode for you all about home buying, and specifically some really great tips for home buying for the self-employed. So for all of you online coaches, online business owners out there, I know that home buying can be a little bit tricky when you become self-employed. It can feel risky. The actual process is a little bit different, but this episode is going to be so helpful for you. I am joined by Justine Chan, who is the founder and CEO of Live with Plum. Live with Plum is the home buying guide for the modern woman. Justine and I connected on Instagram, as a lot of my guests and I do, and I really wanted her to come on the show because I think that the home buying process really needs some help in terms of the entire literacy of it all. And that's what Justine's entire goal is to help especially women understand the process and understand the financial impact of home buying and what home buying can really do for you. So in this episode, we talk about home buying and home ownership as someone who is self-employed or as someone who just doesn't look like the typical home owner. You know, you don't necessarily anymore or ever have to be someone who is married and has the 2.5 kids and the dog and the backyard, and that's the time for you to buy a home. Justine and I both share our personal stories around becoming homeowners as single women and then becoming self-employed and what it looks like and what actually owning a home and doing a little bit of home ownership arbitrage or home hacking, like Justine calls it, has actually helped create a little bit more ease and less risk in our lives as self-employed people. And so we talk about that. We also do touch on the nuances and the subtle differences that is involved in buying a home as someone who is already self-employed and some considerations you might want to take and have in the back of your head if you know that home ownership is something you would like to pursue in the future. And of course, we talk all about money mindset and relationships around money, as well as Justine's next big money adventure. So let's dive on into this episode. There's tons of great tips in store for you today. So here is episode number 156 with Justine Chan. Justine, welcome to the Wander Wealthy Podcast. I am so excited to have you on the show today discussing the topic of home buying and home ownership. But before we dive into that, I'd love to know a little bit more about you. So go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Justine. I am originally from Singapore. It's a tiny little tropical island in the middle of Southeast Asia. But I came to New York about 12 years ago, really for college. And then after that, I decided to stay on for grad school and really loved it. And so I've been here for 12 years. My story, well, this is pretty long, but like I mentioned, I came here for college and grad school. And after that, worked in the city. And it was really fortunate and also on that sort of rat race path for a little bit. So I always worked in, I would say, pretty well-paying jobs, worked in a big management consulting firm. And then after that, worked in a couple of different startups, mostly in the consumer retail side. But overall, it just wasn't feeling very fulfilled working in large corporate jobs. It really felt like I was just jumping from role to role, prioritizing many other things outside of just my mental and physical well-being. And so last year, in late 2019, I decided to take a pause and really try and figure out what I wanted to do, move into a more self-employed position. So right now, I am self-employed as a consultant, mostly for different startups, working on their strategy and operations, but really more like taking a pause to figure out what I wanted to do long-term in my life. So during this period of time, I slowly, tried to figure out if I could combine something that I was personally interested in with something that I was professionally good at. Because I've done so much work in startups, and I was personally interested in real estate, I was doing it on the side really for the entire period of time that I was working full time. And I started to slowly realize that, hey, there was um, there weren't really many educational resources for people who were trying to figure out what they wanted to buy. There were things like direct listing sites like StreetEasy and Zillow, where you could look for different houses, but it wasn't actually anything that was um, sort of a step-by-step guide to teach you how to buy a house. So with that, I decided to set up one, and now I am working on it part-time. It's called Live with Plum, and you can check it out at livewithplum.com. And I am working as a consultant part-time, kind of to bring in income because my that gig doesn't currently bring in any money. So that's my story.
Cool. I love it. Well, and I have so many interesting questions that have come up from your story. And first, what we like to talk about here on the show is also getting an understanding of you as a business owner, as well as like, how you've made decisions in your life, specifically financial decisions. And so I love to understand where you come from and the maybe like the household, or even for you, you grew up in Singapore. And so there's probably a lot of different approaches or mindset around money in general, but also home ownership. So what's kind of the general, I guess the general way of life in Singapore, and maybe whether it does or does not differ from Singapore to the US, and like how people perceive money, but also how people perceive home buying, and kind of, the US is very much like white picket fence, American dream, buy a home. Is it the same or is it very different?
A great question. And honestly, I spent a lot of time thinking about it just because I think whenever you're a foreigner or, you move to a different country, you stay there for a while, you really start to question how being from somewhere else has influenced your way of thinking and your way of being.
Yeah.
So to your question of money, there are really, sort of like three things that I feel like have influenced my thought process on money right now. The first thing is savings rate. It took me a while to realize this, but I save quite a lot of money compared to my peers. And that has just always been the case. I've always been a little bit more money conscious. I do spend on certain things, like I really love eating out, but I save on things like rent, and I generally I don't go out like drinking that much. That my peers used to do a lot, especially living in New York City. So saving is like something that I think I just got because I grew up in Singapore and people were just a lot more money conscious and probably not as consumer driven as the US, which is a little, and that is definitely different. The second thing is, I think the concept of home ownership is pretty different where I grew up versus here. So in Singapore, the rate of home ownership is really high. There are tons of like government incentives to help people to buy homes. So we're really talking about like 90% of the population owning a home. Wow. Something crazy high. Don't quote me on that, but it's crazy high.
Yeah.
It's heavily subsidized for your first house. And most people I know, will purchase a first house once they start getting married, which is in their like late 20s, early 30s, late 30s, basically that age range, right? And so for me, buying a home, even as a single woman, in my late 20s, is more unusual here, but isn't really that unusual back in Singapore. Like most of my friends that I grew up with were already in the process of buying a home or already owned a home. So it wasn't that unusual. And I think, to have like that as a baseline and be like, okay, at least a portion of my friends are doing it, was a little comforting, because here it's like actually pretty unusual, actually, especially in New York City.
Right.
And then the last thing, and really about my relationship with money is I feel pretty fortunate. So where I grew up in a dual income household. I was one of four people, but then again, my mom, she was a very strong woman. She was always like the investing one in the relationship. And my parents talked very freely about money. It's actually pretty funny because this time around when I was home, my parents actually talked about things like inheritance. So very openly, right? Things that I it has dawned on me that other people don't really talk about. And so for me, I always felt very comfortable talking about it, because I grew up in an environment where people talked about it pretty freely. And I also grew up in an environment where, investing was like the norm. So
Yeah.
from a young age, my mom would encourage me to invest in the stock market, even if I didn't know what I was doing.
Right.
She would just say like, okay, take a tiny little bit of money, go and buy a couple of stocks and see what happens. And I think this was when I was still in school.
Yeah. That's so cool too that she was the investor of the family unit, and then she gave you that opportunity. And it's not even like, parents don't necessarily have to give their kids money or have them start like at a very young age. It's almost, and I don't know if if you were using your own money or her money or whatever, however it divulges, but it's more about the making it safe part of being like, this is a safe thing for you to do. And if you if you fail, it's okay, because it's the process of learning.
Yeah. And you're a kid, right? So when you do, it's kind of like skiing. So when you do it when you're young, you have no fear attached to it.
Oh, I love
And
that.
and it was, at the end of the day, everything was her money when you're a child, right? Like
Right.
she would give you allowance, and so that was now your money, but really it was her money,
Yeah.
or your parents' money. So I think it's kind of like skiing. So when you do it when you're young, there's no fear attached. You just do it, and then when you're older, you're like, okay, I've done it since I was young. Why am I afraid?
Right. That is such a good analogy. And it's so funny because, like, whether it's skiing or it's like the monkey bars is something I think about a lot, because it shows up in my, I think in our everyday, if you like go to any old gym, you might find like monkey bars or a pull-up bar or something. And when you're little, you can like swing yourself around and you have no fear. And then when you're older, you're like, I can't even hang from a bar.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I remember so clearly. So I bought it when I was young, and then honestly, I wasn't that consistent, so I kind of forget about it. And then when I went back to it again, and maybe this was like 2 years later, I was like, whoa, this has grown, And so that was something that just got kind of nailed into me. Like, money grows if you invest. That's not always the case, right? Like, especially now, I fully understand that. But
Sure.
I think at that point in time, it was like a revelation. Like, okay, I need to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think as you get older and you develop more logical thinking, it's really hard to wrap your mind around how investments grow when you can't like see it tangibly. And so that can be really tricky when you start to have all these other kind of like questioning and skeptical thoughts about like, no, wait, that's too good to be true. And it's like, well, okay, now you need to understand that there's upsides and downsides.
Yeah. But overall, I think I would like to think I have a pretty healthy relationship with money, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think we all have our own little things that we know we need to work on. But overall, it's really cool to see the cultural dynamic, but also like everyone in their own family units gets such an interesting perspective, passed down to them, and as they grow up into being their own human. And I wanted to touch on a couple things because I think it is interesting. I don't know what the job market is like in Singapore either, but I'm sure that probably impacts people's ability, or even like student loans, the job market, and also those government incentives are all massive variables that can impact people's ability or willingness to get into the housing market. And it's just really interesting to understand that, and then also gain perspective on like how you could maybe use that, or just understand it and do things a little bit differently. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about is because the majority of the people in my audience are self-employed. And I know with your work now, you're like consulting for a couple different companies, and you're doing this side hustle to help people gain literacy around home buying, which I absolutely love. And I think what can be tricky for those who are self-employed is there's a couple of different nuances and rules to getting in the home buying market. And we'll talk about that. That's more of like the how stuff that we don't need to like spend too much time on. But what I did want to spend time on is basically the ability and willingness to do things differently than how, say, the expectation is, or how you should, and when is the right time to do them from the past. And what I mean by that is, you had mentioned in Singapore, it's very normal to buy a home once you get married. And in the US, that's kind of the same path. But then we also have the whole aspect of like, oh, and then maybe you should like try to get your student loans underway. And then you're going to have to like make enough money, which a lot of people graduating from college aren't making as much money as comparative to what it was like, 20 years ago. But well, let's start with that. How did you get started in buying homes for yourself? And now you've kind of done a little bit of arbitrage to make it even more, make it make sense for you to be a homeowner as someone who's now taking risks and becoming more self-employed.
Yeah. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And, this is something that I feel like just by doing it, I hope to set an example for other people who feel like they need to look, like you mentioned, right? They need to look a certain way or they need to be a certain way. And I think there are a couple of different things. So firstly, on the financial side, there are a couple of things that you do kind of need to check. You should check the box before you buy a house, right? And that to me, it's like more a matter of financial health than anything else, including getting a credit score in order, including, paying off some of your really high interest debt before, and saving for a good amount of down payment, not just the bare minimum or not going for a zero down payment, but, saving for a comfortable buffer. So there are a couple of things on the financial side that I do feel like, okay, really kind of go check those boxes first. But in terms of more the, what you need to be, and do you need to be a married couple? Do you need to be a single person? Do you need to like make a high income? Yada yada. All those things question and keep questioning for sure. And see, if home ownership really is something that you aspire to and you really want to do, then there are ways to navigate this. So for me, my first place was tiny, like even small by New York standards, like teeny tiny. And I think that's actually something pretty different that I did versus many of my friends. So many of my friends, when they buy, they kind of buy and settle in. And so they're thinking of, buying the place that they're going to like live in forever, or they invest a ton of money into renovations because they want to make it perfect and pristine for themselves. That wasn't my mindset at all. Mine was always like, what can I buy that's, that I feel comfortable with, that I can pay off. And this is just literally my starter home. And then after that, I'll move and I'll move to somewhere bigger. My first place was maybe not even 400 square feet in total, like including the bathroom, like it was a studio. So the kitchen was meshed with the living area, which was meshed with the bedroom. I remember I even had to have a bunk bed because it just wasn't like enough space to have the bed and to have everything else, a desk that I wanted.
Right.
So you can start really small. It was like, it wasn't cheap by, I think, the entire US standards, but it was definitely really inexpensive by New York City standards.
Right.
And, do that, right? Like what compromises are you willing to make right now to make it happen?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I do right now, which makes it more, which makes house ownership more accessible in some ways, is this concept called house hacking. So basically what it means is if you live in an apartment, so right now I live in like a 3-bedroom apartment, that you live in one of the bedrooms and then you rent out the other bedroom, the 2 other bedrooms that I have right now. Or if you live in, for example, a multi-family house, you live in one of the units and then you rent out the other units. So what this does is it helps you at least bring in some income from the unit that you own. And the second thing that it does is if you own a unit, it's called a primary residence. And usually interest rates for primary residents are lower than interest rates for investment properties. So if you house hack, it's because you're seen as a lower risk than a pure investor who doesn't live in their house. So if you house hack, you do get to enjoy those lower interest rates, and yet you also get to enjoy income that's similar to an investment property. So it allows you like the best of both worlds. And for me personally, and many people I know are able to do this, I actually can cover my mortgage and my HOA fees and my taxes just through the income I'm getting from my two tenants.
Mm-hmm.
So it just makes living in New York City a lot more affordable. And especially in my situation of being self-employed, it really gave me the confidence to be able to, jump into self-employment with less stable income, knowing that, my housing expenses are a lot lower.
Yeah. I love that. I love first that you pointed out that, you know, in the beginning of all of this, it still has to make sense for you. So make sure that you're, looking at your credit score, getting that up to snuff. Make sure that you do have some sort of buffer, because even if you do ultimately end up house hacking, you could have a leaky roof and then have to repair that. And that's still going to cost a lot of money. So it totally, you want to make sure you check all the boxes leading up to it. But then the mindset of saying, okay, I can look like a single woman who is, and maybe this is before you take the risk of becoming self-employed or after, but you can still be a single woman who doesn't have to be thinking, this is where I'm going to settle down, but this is just a strategy I'm willing to employ in regards to my lifestyle that's going to make me able to take on so many more risks and say yes to so many more opportunities. And that's something that I loved, learning about you and your ability to do, and that you're also teaching others how to do. And that's something that I did, almost unintentionally in my home buying journey. And it was really like I bought a house because I wanted to be able to collect rent and like do it as somewhat of an investment property. I didn't realize that doing that though would then help me ultimately leave my job, and then would help me, be able to essentially have really, really minimal month to month living costs, and then would allow me to leave the country and be able to go move to Italy and be with my fiance, which now this is where we live. And that house is just now a rental property. But it's like, it's also knowing that like your life can totally change, and you can think about the process differently, as opposed to like, this has to be my forever home that I'm going to put a shit ton of money in and completely renovate. It's like, this can be a starter home, and then I can get another home, and then I can rent out the rooms. And then like, if my life changes, I can decide what to do with that, but it doesn't have to go from like family home to family home to family home. And between each, you have to sell and repurchase and sell and repurchase with that mindset, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and another caveat that I also like to say is, I do agree with people that home ownership doesn't have to be like the golden standard for everyone. If you do want to choose to rent for the rest of your life, like that's okay. I don't think there should ever be any judgment between like someone choosing to buy or someone choosing to rent. You do whatever you want, but I think the thing is, if you do want to live in a certain way, you have to be fully considerate of all the options that are available. You should never kind of, say home buying doesn't make sense to me because I look a certain way, or home buying does make sense to me only because I look a certain way. Like, it should be a dream that everyone has access to, as long as you're educated about the process.
Yeah. And that's really important that you brought that up, because I've been sometimes a little pessimistic towards home ownership in the past, because I felt like I didn't have this type of literacy available to me when I got into buying a home. And then I see, a lot of people buying homes, and I want to show them that they have options. It doesn't have to look this one way. And so I had a hard time communicating that before. And I'm really, now I'm like, whether you buy a home with your partner and your two dogs and you have the white picket fence, if that's what you want, that's great. If instead you want to do something strategic because you want to be able to travel or, take a leap of faith out of your corporate job, you can do something like homeownership can also work for you. And then alternatively, if renting makes sense because you don't want to have to take on the risk of a leaky roof or a broken HVAC system, like that's great too. They all can make sense for anyone. And it's really about looking at, what sort of lifestyle do you want to live within the thing that, makes sense financially too? Because I think that sometimes our decisions around homeownership can lead to greater financial burden than good. And that's why I think it's important that you're doing the work that you are.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think the other thing that based on what you said, really brought this up for me is the changing face of home ownership is also really interesting. And I personally don't feel like the real estate industry is doing enough to address that. So I'll give you a couple of stats that, like, when I read it, I was also really shocked. But women basically are, the largest home buyers in the US. So
Really?
the biggest group of home buyers in the US is married couples, and right after that is single women. And
Amazing.
single women buy at like almost double the rate of single men. This has been consistent throughout the many years that people have studied this basically. But single women buy way more than single men. And when you dig into the data a little bit more, it gets even more interesting because when people think of single woman, you really start to, sometimes you immediately think of young professionals, similar to you and me, but really the kind of average age of single women who are buying is in her 40s, and that's
Mhm.
actually older than single men, and also lower income
Mm.
than single men. So many women, it's if you think about our life circumstances, it starts to make sense. Like our home buying circumstances are typically not really the same as guys. You have the group that's like us, right? Like single women, who want to purchase before they get married or they don't choose to get married, whatever it is. That's
Mhm.
one group. The second group is women who have been married previously.
Mhm.
So nowadays divorce rates are like getting, significant enough, right? That a
Right.
good percentage of the population do, are single post divorce. And women buy in higher rates because they tend to be the head of the household, and you want a bit more stability, also. And
Mhm.
then the third group of women is actually we just live longer. We statistically live longer than men. And so when your partner passes on, your relationship to your home may also change. Maybe you
Mhm.
don't want to stay there anymore for various reasons. Maybe, if you have children, you want to move closer to where they are. So there really is a lot of subgroups within this category. And the other really big takeaway is that as women, our relationship to home ownership is just fundamentally pretty different from men. And it shows when you dig into the data, that we, on average, buy homes at much higher rates than men do.
Mm. And it just goes to show why it is so important that we understand then the
Absolutely.
entire process of buying a home rather than, and I think, this is the biggest thing that I see is a lot of people are so focused on the down payment that they
Hmm.
get wrapped up into like, okay, I just have to save enough so I can buy my, $400,000 home. And so then they
Hmm.
focus on the down payment and they don't really understand, what happens after you close on your home. So
Yeah.
can we speak to that a little bit? Like what are some things that we need to know before we even probably start our home search process? Like
Yeah.
what homeownership looks like after you go into the closing and purchase it.
Yeah. You know what? I want to speak about, I can't speak about that. I think I also want to, help the audience kind of understand maybe the different phases of home ownership.
Ooh, yeah, I
And
like
for
that.
me, I actually broke it down on my site, and I broke it down into three phases. So I call the first phase pre-home buying. And the way that I would think about it is everything kind of before even you start searching for a house. And this is actually the phase that I think people don't think about enough. Or you're right, they only think about the down payment and they don't think about anything else. And most people, when they think about home buying, they really only start, thinking about the process 1 year before they want to start owning a home. But in my opinion, planning for home buying is quite like planning for retirement. So
Sure.
basically, when you get your first job, if home ownership is a goal for you, you should start thinking about it already. So there's pre-home buying, and the couple of things that I want to focus on in pre-home buying is one, credit scores. So getting your credit scores in order is really important because then you can take advantage, of this to have as wide, availability of mortgage options as possible. And
Mhm.
also, the higher your credit score, the lower your interest rate. That's just the way it works.
Yeah.
The second thing through, in this phase is how much do you actually have to save. So you're right, like there's the down payment. And then after that, closing costs are typically about 2 to 5% of purchase price.
Mhm. Yeah, that was one that I was
So
like, wait, I have to pay more than like how
yes,
much I've already saved?
closing costs is incredibly expensive, and I think most people don't know about this. Um, yeah, so it's 2 to 5% on top of your down payment, which is typically about 20% for a conventional loan, or lower if you choose other lower down payment options.
Hmm.
But 2 to 5% is pretty significant because for a $400,000 home, you're talking about up to $20,000 in closing costs to
Hmm.
save up for. And then the next phase, the second phase is the phase that I call home buying, which is, what people typically think about, right? Which is searching for a home, working with a real estate agent, getting a mortgage, and then after that, closing. So this phase I wouldn't spend so much time on because I think this is the piece that most people already are pretty familiar with. To your
Hmm.
question on post home buying and what that looks like, um, is it's really I think the piece that always takes people by surprise is the cost of maintaining a home.
Hmm.
There are things like you should, in my opinion, you should buffer in repair and maintenance costs. So whether you own a home as a rental property or whether you own a home as a primary resident, you buffer in like whatever amount you feel comfortable with, maybe like 5 to 10% of what the apartment or the property will rent out for. Um,
Okay.
is a good gauge to go by. That's kind of the amount that some people will put in when you're trying to estimate whether a investment property um is the expenses of a investment property.
Yeah.
So put in an amount that you feel comfortable with. But I feel like that's usually the piece that takes people by surprise. The other piece might also be rising taxes,
Hmm.
especially in an area that's like rapidly changing. That's something that also, if you are purchasing investment property or if you're a private resident, you should also factor in that your taxes will go up.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I would say it's mostly the cost of unexpected maintenance,
Hmm.
and making sure you have sufficient monetary buffer to deal with it.
Yeah. It's so funny because when I bought my home, I started scrubbing things I never thought I would scrub, like the baseboards and the doors. And I was like, when I was renting, like that's just something I never even
Yeah, you
thought
don't
about
do.
looking at. Like you don't even look at it. And now you're like,
Yeah,
this is my thing that I own and I have to sell someday and it can't be caked on
yeah.
dirt and stuff on here. So it is really interesting especially also just the responsibility that you take on as a homeowner of then knowing like this is something that I need to maintain and that's really important and it costs money and that's just like, it's kind of like when you're planning a wedding or when you're at the airport and they know they got you so they're going to charge you more, like you're a homeowner now, they got you, you have to
Hmm.
spend quite a bit of money to maintain it, which is all good and fine as long as you know what to expect. And so it's almost like looking at that post home buying phase and being able to prepare for that in your pre home buying phase, like knowing what that's going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that also brings up a good point. Like, um, there are also many different kinds of homes that you can buy. And some homes require less maintenance than others, right? So you bought a house, and a house generally is like the highest level of responsibility. Everything is your responsibility. And I own apartments because it's New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Apartment generally is less lower responsibility, but on the flip side, you have to pay HOA fees for
Right.
someone to maintain the building itself. So if you are a beginner home buyer, that's also something to think about, right? Like how much responsibility do you want to have, and what might be like a good starter home for you to purchase first, and
Mm-hmm.
just get a sense of what home ownership is.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. It definitely um helps me out for sure, especially because I am living so far away from the home that I own, is owning a condo and then paying HOA fees, which aren't always fun because they have more than
Hmm.
doubled in the 7 years that I've owned it, or
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
it's only been 5. But it's because we plan to make repairs and we know we know why we're doing it,
Yeah.
and it almost works a little bit better because you can budget that out versus like, oh yeah, we have to replace the roof. That's going to cost
Yeah.
$10,000.
It's more being in an apartment, it has more stability from that point of view. than a house where like you take on the entire monetary responsibility of any change.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last question in terms of like tangible tips that we can squeeze out of you, Justine, is for a self-employed person. I feel like homeownership can feel like a risky move for those who, their income is fluctuating. And we already touched on the fact that like if planned appropriately, you can actually get a home. And then as long as you're willing to, have your lifestyle look a little bit differently, or you're willing to sacrifice in certain areas. So maybe you don't live by yourself and you have some roommates, or you rent out, I rented out on Airbnb for a while when I didn't really know what I was going to be doing next. If you're willing to do that, it can actually reduce the risk for you rather than make it greater. Or in an investment standpoint, like the return, you can see the return while also knowing that there is a risk, there is a downside, but it also makes your day-to-day living, pretty risk-free in a sense. But in order to get there, if the people listening are already self-employed, what are some things that they need to know before they're able to purchase a home? Because I do know it is a little bit different for someone who has a traditional, W-2 income.
Yeah. So the most important thing for anyone self-employed is that, and most people actually don't know this, so this is really important to just keep kind of sharing, is you need about 2 years of stable income tax returns. So stable income over 2 years that's documented on your income tax for mortgage brokers to be willing to loan to you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something to think about even before you move into self-employment, or if you're already currently in self-employment and you just started it. It's the mortgage industry is just kind of archaic. They abide by all these rules that might not be applicable for today's worker, and how the everyone's kind of working situation has changed. So we are still in the world where everyone assumes that you have a W-2 job and you have a steady situation for employment. So the unfortunate fact is you do need 2 years of pretty stable income on your income tax, and to prove it through your income tax return before you can get a mortgage. So there are a couple of implications for this, right? One, if you are not already self-employed and you're thinking of moving to self-employment, and you want to own a home, you might want to consider purchasing while you're, in a W-2 job and then moving to self-employment, because that change, it's not like the mortgage lender is going to take back your mortgage. Like, they're probably not going to do that, right?
They didn't come after me, so I can attest to that.
Yeah, they didn't come after me too. So I was like, okay, yay, thank you. So that's one thing to think about. If you're not already self-employed, think about, how do you maintain your income streams pretty consistently for 2 years before you go to a mortgage broker, because they want to see steady income. Like, that's the thing. They want to see that you financially can pay back. And it doesn't matter how much buffer you already have. They kind of don't care, like, that you have, a ton of money saved up, for example. It's all about the income and proving that you can pay it back. And it doesn't make sense, at least to me in my head, but it's a system that you just have to understand and then play by those rules. And that's the unfortunate reality. But educating yourself again on the system, and then, navigating your life such that that is a goal that you can still achieve within this system.
Yeah. Yeah. And just knowing that, like, doing this, and if you do house hack in this way, it is going to create a little bit more ease in your life in terms of managing fixed expenses. It could be something that then you're like, okay, how am I going to fix my life over the next 2 years to make sure that I can be approved for a mortgage? And I think, something like what you're doing, or something like what I did when I first became self-employed, I actually did some contract work for almost 2 years. And so that would be a really good way to, okay, I can find some part-time contract work while also building out my business. Yeah. Unless your business is already taken off, then girl, go for it. Like that works too. But finding something,
if you're in that situation, good.
Yeah, finding something that's stable. And if right now the business isn't providing that stability, you can kind of find a way to hack it, or say, okay, well, I can commit 20 hours of my of
Yeah.
my week to, working on contract, and there's a lot that can come out of doing that too, because you learn so much about business in general. So it can be,
Yep.
it can be a benefit that then you get paid to learn. So
Yep.
that's how it worked for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Justine, thank you so much for sharing all of these amazing tips and your insights around home purchasing. One quick question. You shared a lot of good insight into your money relationship and money story as well. So, my one question for the money round is just, what's your next step? What is your next goal in terms of what you plan to do financially in your life? Are you planning to increase the number of homes or apartments that you own, or are you focused more on business right now? What do you got going on?
Uh, so for me, I just became self-employed. There are a couple of things. I just became self-employed, so I'm trying to see, how I can make self-employment financially viable.
Hmm.
And it takes time to get there. So that's like my number one goal because I love this life. Like, I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Right.
But also, at least for my background, having stable employment has been more financially lucrative than being self-employed for the very short amount of time that I have been. So that's like one of a huge money goal of mine. Like, how do I actually combine my personal interest with my professional career?
Sure.
And then secondly, on the investing side, is to just find a way to do it at a volume um, that that's beyond what I've done before.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. All right, we're going to go into the quick and dirty Q&A round. These are just a couple fast-paced questions to wrap up the show. And we'll start with something that is very random that you have been kind of obsessed with or interested in that we want to know about. What would that one random thing be?
Oh, it's also a real estate investor. Like I've just in investing related. I've just been reading a ton about this. But a piece of research was just released in 2019 that shows that women actually there's a gender gap in housing returns. And what this means is that women, for the exact same property, because they looked at millions of transactions over 26 years, women purchase the same home for more money and sell it for less money. So we're talking about a couple percentage points each way, but it adds up, right? Because
Right.
it's such a big wealth builder for women, especially because we purchase more. But this is a fact that I've been obsessed with and really trying to like spread the message about. And it's similar to like the salary gap, where part of it is because of negotiations. But
Yeah.
basically, yeah, we negotiate less, and that's why, we buy houses for more and sell them for less, and that's terrible. I hate it. I hate it so much
Yeah.
that I'm unfortunately quite obsessed with it at this point in time.
Yeah, but good to know because that can be fuel for your fire, for anybody's fire, whoever is purchasing and selling homes. It's always better to know that.
Oh, for sure.
Who or what is your favorite account to follow on social media?
I like. Have you heard of Save My Sense?
No, but I'm going to write it down.
She has. She's pretty big right now. She's also based in New York City. She's a new mom. Um, I love the account because it's really honest. She 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 just like tells it as it is and gives really direct, straight advice. I feel like on social media, some people have the tendency to kind of, put in really like interesting quotes or, pictures of themselves and what they're doing, and all that's great. But I really like Save My Sense because it's a really good balance of, her personal life, and then after that, a ton of tips
Yeah,
on
cool.
how to improve your finances.
Awesome. What is the best piece of financial advice you've been told that you'd like to pass along?
My number one tip for most people is just to start. I think women, like, we kind of hold ourselves back from anything and are fearful of things. And that's the number one tip for women. Like, just start. Start small, but just start. Time is always your friend.
Oh, I love it. Justine, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of this with us. Please tell us where we can find you so we can stay in touch and follow along with what you're building.
I am on Instagram at Live with Plum. So that's Live with Plum, Plum. And I am on in the webs at livewithplum.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Justine, again for coming on the show. This has been so educational and insightful. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
And that's a wrap on episode 156 with Justine Chan. If you guys want to get at some of the resources that she mentioned in this episode, specifically Justine's website, follow her on social media, then head to wanderwealthypodcast.com/podcast/episode 156. And before we go, I have one quick note for you. Now that we are well into 2020, I wonder if you have some specific numbers that you are looking to reach in your business this year, whether it's a full-time business or a side hustle or something that you're just getting started with. By using the Easy Profit Roadmap, which you can download for free by going to wanderwealthy.com/roadmap or clicking the link in the description or in the show notes of this episode, you can identify and put a number to your goals. Now, why is this beneficial? It's helpful because you will know exactly what you're shooting for and why you're shooting for it. One of the biggest gripes I've had in my entrepreneurial journey and helping other business owners set and define their revenue goals for their business and what they'd like to create for the year is when there's a bunch of other coaches or I work with clients who come to me and say, I want 10K months or I'd just like to hit 6 figures. And I always ask, why? For what purpose would you like to have those 10K months? And the answers are kind of crickety. There's not much behind those. And it's because we've been bombarded with the idea that these 10K months are the end-all be-all thing to shoot for. Now, I'm not saying they're bad. Having 10K months is great. Having that sexy number on your mirror is wonderful to look at and envision yourself making. What I argue is, why don't we infuse your goals, and especially if we're going to put numbers towards your goals, why don't we infuse them with purpose? Why don't we make sure that we are building a business that is taking your personal life and the goals you have for yourself into consideration while also taking all the other aspects of business, the real world side of business, into consideration too, such as taxes and business expenses and all of that good, sexy stuff. Why don't we do an entire wholesome and holistic look at what you need to be aiming for in your business, again, whether it's a side hustle or it's a full-time endeavor, and we put that into your overall goals for the year. And in order to do that, you might need a little roadmap to get you started. That's why the Easy Profit Roadmap is so helpful for people to just plug and chug their numbers into the worksheet and identify their purpose-driven revenue goals so that they have something that is infueled with what it is they want to achieve, not only in their business, but also in their life. So if you go to wanderwealthy.com/roadmap, you can download it. You'll get the Easy Profit Math, which is a little worksheet that you can work through. And I'll even send you an email with a video of me walking through how to do that math, because I know math doesn't make everyone feel super confident and able, but I promise you it is easy, and I'll walk you through step by step exactly how to do it. So wanderwealthy.com/roadmap, go ahead and take a picture of it as you are filling it out. Share it on Instagram. Tag me at Tess_Wicks. I want to see your numbers. And if it's not going to be the numbers, at least take a picture of the cover so we can celebrate together. Thank you so much again for joining me today. Until next time, I hope you wander wealthy.